Okay, this is Section 8, Block 8, Pax Americana, Section 3, Problems in Asia, with the section The Korean War. Here we have a map of Korea after World War II. Korea, during the war and beforehand, was a Japanese colony. When the war ended, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed that the Soviets would occupy the northern half of Korea, north of the 38th line of latitude here, and that the United States would occupy Korea south of the 38th parallel. And the intention was one day to reunite Korea under one government. However, the beginning of the Cold War and obvious differences between the United States and the Soviet Union meant that Korea soon became two countries. Above the 38th parallel, the Soviets installed a communist regime led by Kim Il-sung, and in the south, the United with its capital at Pyongyang, and in the south, the United States installed an anti-communist regime with its capital in Seoul, ruled by a man by the name of Syngman Rhee. And the peace was kind of uneasily kept along this 38th parallel. In early 1950, the American Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, gave a speech, and in this speech, Acheson listed the countries that was kind of under American protection. Britain was under American protection. France was under American protection. Italy was under American protection. Greece, Turkey. They named, areas of the British Empire, and left out. Now, we don't know why it was left. Did Acheson mess up? Did Acheson not think that anybody cared that much about Korea? But to make a long story short, Dean Acheson, when he listed all the countries that the United States would defend, did not include South Korea. This made Stalin very curious. Stalin's role in what happened next is debated. It is hard to believe that a communist dictator installed into power by Stalin could not move without Stalin's permission. But it seems that Kim Il-sung did what he did without Stalin's express permission. It might have been tacit, but once he did it, Stalin did support him. And what he did, Kim Il-sung and the North Koreans, probably with the backing of the Soviet Union, and using, well, in any case, they were using Soviet-made weapons. They blasted across the 38th parallel in a surprise attack into the unready and undermanned and underfunded and underarmed South Korean forces. And it drove them back. In the United States, the hollering began immediately. This is exactly what the policy of containment was supposed to prevent. That if there was a vacuum of power, South Korea is not strong, communists will move into anywhere where there is a power vacuum. This is where containment has to roll in. And people started arguing, anti-communists especially, that if the United States did nothing, then the containment policy would look just as weak as the appeasement policy of the 1930s. People started mentioning Munich and Chamberlain, and if you just let dictators and communists and other nasty assorted people do what they want to do. This is the first great test of the United Nations. The United States went to the United Nations Security Council to obtain a unanimous condemnation of the North Korean attack. But remember, the Security Council is United States, Great Britain, and France. You can count on the three of them ruling that this is an unprovoked attack against the UN Charter. You could count on China also, because the government of at the United Nations, the communist government had not been recognized yet, and that Republican China, under Chiang Kai-shek, on the little island of Formosa, held China's seat. So you could count on four of five Security Council votes in favor of condemning the North Korean attack. But you would imagine that the Soviet Union would veto that. Strangely enough, and to this day no one really knows why, the Soviet Union, the Soviet delegate could not be found. They looked for him. They couldn't find him. He was nowhere that anybody could find. So without the Soviet Union, the rest of the Security Council voted 4-0, with the Soviet Union being absent. that North Korea was named as an aggressor, and then the United Nations took the further step of asking all available nations to render assistance and to restore peace. Now, in reality, when you say the United Nations, whether it is 1950 or 2013, you mean the United States, because the United Nations does not move without American support, money, and power. Truman used this United Nations resolution as permission to move without consulting Congress. Truman ordered, 2 days after this Security Council vote, 2 days after the vote, Truman ordered air and naval forces from Japan to help the South Koreans. And then within a week, once he realized that the South Koreans were not going to be able to stop the communist attack on their own, he ordered General MacArthur with the occupation forces in Japan to proceed into action against the North Koreans alongside the South Koreans. NSC 68 was pulled out of its dusty drawer, put into effect, and American defense spending soared. What MacArthur is able to do at the beginning is not much. As you see on the map, the non-communist forces were pushed into this tiny little area around the city of Busan, and the port of Busan was the only port in which supplies were coming into South Korea. And it looked for a little while that American help would come too late to prevent communists from taking over all of Korea. But then General MacArthur came up with one more brilliant military move. With command of the sea, General MacArthur, and you see him over here, he is thoroughly enjoying himself. With command of the sea, MacArthur completely outflanked the North Korean forces. He landed with a powerful invasion force at the city of Incheon to the south and west of the capital of Seoul, and installed himself behind all the communist forces and threatened to cut them off from their supply lines from North Korea. Once all of these American troops were in their rear, the communists had to flee the perimeter around Busan. And then it became a race up towards and into North Korea. You can tell from this map the blue is UN forces, mostly American and South Korean, but with a smattering of other countries also. MacArthur is conquering all of Korea, and he is approaching the border of communist China, which is at the Yalu River. Here's the Yalu River, and you can see that the communist forces are already pushed up against it. Here comes MacArthur with the rest of them, and all of a sudden, newly communist China is getting very concerned. They do not want an anti-communist American army right on their border. And they start letting it be known that if MacArthur approaches the Yalu River, they will attack. The UN, which in this case really meant the US, didn't really believe them. And they kind of took the war to a higher level. That the original mission was to restore South Korea. But now, all of a sudden, with the military success, Americans and the UN start thinking, hey, we can reunite Korea, we can kick the communists out of power, and kind of create one country on the Korean peninsula. They're approaching the Chinese border. The Chinese say, if you approach China's border, we're going to come into the war. MacArthur had a very low opinion of the Chinese ability to fight, and he kind of ignored the Chinese threats and continued driving the North Korean forces towards China. And then China attacked. With a massive army of over 300,000, newly victorious in their own civil war, the Chinese streamed across the Yalu River, and all of a sudden now it was MacArthur and the Americans and the South Koreans falling all the way back. They abandoned Seoul again before MacArthur finally stabilized the line here. This is this is nasty, nasty fighting. Some of the coldest fighting, or fighting in coldest weather that the American troops have ever undertaken. This fighting to kind of stabilize the border, to stop this Chinese assault around the 38th parallel. Finally, MacArthur did retake Seoul and established kind of a line where the fighting kind of stalled out. And now with the fighting stalled out, that with this North Koreans and Chinese on one side, the South Koreans and the Americans on the other, it became a stalemate. And there was nothing MacArthur hated more than a war where he couldn't move, a stalemate, a war he couldn't win. Now MacArthur asks President Truman to widen the war. Truman wants bombing runs on Chinese cities. MacArthur wants bombing of Chinese cities. He wants a blockade of China's coast. He wants to bomb Chinese supply lines, and he even presses for the use of nuclear weapons on the supply lines streaming from China into North Korea. He says, we have the nuclear weapons, why don't we use them? The whole point of a war is to win. Truman is taking a broader view. Truman is unwilling to widen the war further. Truman figures he's already at war with China. The last thing he needs is to be at war with the Soviet Union. Truman realized that the more and more people that the Americans pumped into South Korea, the weaker and weaker and weaker Americans and the free world would be around the world, which might start to make the Soviets trigger happy. Truman pretty much said to MacArthur, we are not widening the war. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff backed the president, saying that this war in Korea, as important as it might have been at the beginning to keep South Korea free, if it went as far as MacArthur wanted it to go, would be the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time. And no further escalation of troops, machines, men, supplies came to MacArthur. He was stuck fighting with the level of troops that he had when the front stabilized. This was not satisfactory to MacArthur. MacArthur did not, he personally didn't, he didn't have a problem with Truman. He just didn't respect him as president. And he started to publicly criticize his commander-in-chief in the press. He said, I can't believe I'm being forced to fight with one hand behind my back. He said, how can a war be limited? The whole purpose of war is to win. There's no substitute for victory, MacArthur said. That if you're going to risk men's lives, you ought to risk them in order to win the war, not to achieve some kind of limited political goal. And he publicly starts to criticize the president. He publicly questions President Truman's handling of the war. And in the United States of America, where civilian control over the military must be absolute, Truman had no choice but to fire the incredibly popular general. And in 1951, Truman fired MacArthur. Here they are meeting before his firing. Truman took the step of flying to Hawaii to meet with MacArthur. You can see him meeting with MacArthur here. And this is where MacArthur kind of asked him for that widening of the war. Truman said no. MacArthur criticized Truman, and then Truman fired him. MacArthur returns home to a wildly triumphant popular welcome. Truman sinks to levels of disapproval that had not been seen since Herbert Hoover. But to his dying day, Truman believed that what he did was right. And it turns out that history has certainly vindicated him. Truman was right to fire MacArthur, that the United States cannot have generals criticizing the president over their course of, over their conduct of a war in their position as commander-in-chief. So MacArthur was fired, and soon thereafter, peace negotiations got underway. Truce negotiations. But they soon snagged over this issue and that issue. Fighting would continue along this line for another 2 years, and men were dying on both sides. But this map, what you're pretty much seeing here, is what the map of Korea looks like today. That there is that the war never ended. North Korea and South Korea are still technically at war. Only a truce keeps them apart. And this border between North Korea and South Korea is the most heavily defended border on Earth. And to this day, there are still 30,000 American troops patrolling that border with the South Koreans. South Korea in time becomes a free, prosperous, democratic, capitalist country. North Korea becomes the worst country on the planet Earth to live in. It is literally the worst country in the world to live in. There is starvation, bizarre political. It's a mess. Go do your own research if you're interested in the Hermit Kingdom and the weirdness of North Korea. The Korean War kills over 30,000 American troops, but it is very largely forgotten today. Because we didn't win. I mean, we saved South Korea, but it's kind of a forgotten war for many, many people, although hundreds of thousands served and 30,000 did not make it home. But that's the Korean War. It's a check of the policy of containment. And it does indeed work. That South Korea was saved, South Korea was not conquered, that communism was contained back behind where it had originated. And that's the Korean War.